see.
Welcome to Musical Orbits webinar on contemporary opera with soprano Laure Meloy. Hi Laura, where are you?
Hi, I'm in Vienna right now.
And which opera are you working on at the moment?
Working on The Tempest by Thomas Addis. It's a British composer. So we're singing in English, but I'm doing my best to brush up my German when I'm out and about.
And how are the rehearsals going? You've just started recently?
We just started this week. So we started with musical rehearsals with the composer who's also conducting the opera present for the first couple of days. And we've moved into the physical rehearsal. There's a lot of physical theater in this production. There are dancers and acrobats, and the character of Ariel, which I'm covering, is also required to do a lot of physical work. So a lot of acrobatic sort of dance-like moves and climbing on chandeliers, and it's very complicated stage business as well as being complicated music. So we've been, my muscles are a bit sore.
Yeah, how does that work then? So you're covering that role at the moment. So
yeah.
obviously the main Ariel will be, what do you do, half and half, practicing all the acrobatics, or do you?
I'm watching her taking copious notes, trying to note exactly what she's doing where, trying to shadow it, and then when she's having a break, I'm on the equipment sweating. It's not a role you could jump into. It's not a production you could jump into without any rehearsal, and you need to check things like, what does it feel like to be on the end of a wire suspended over the stage while you're singing, and several acrobats are swinging you back and forth and out over the audience. So I do need that time, and I'm just begging for it. And whenever she's got a break or this clear space, I say, I'm going to go click on that now, or I'm going to go try this out. And the dance staff, the choreographers have been brilliant in giving me as much help as they possibly can.
Yeah. And how is it, so singing and hanging? I mean, I'm a violinist, so I can't imagine hanging and playing. But how very difficult is it? I mean, I know I had some friends who once had to sing upside down, and that was a real nightmare. What's it like in this particular production?
Well, they're very sensitive. The designers and the costume designers and everybody who's involved with it, they have custom made harnesses. When you do flying, when it any kind of stage wire work, they have very strong, secure harnesses on you, so there's nothing going to happen to you. And they've made them specifically so that you can still breathe. They're not going to be constricting. They understand what singers need. We need to be able to breathe. We need to be able to feel comfortable with that. So they've very carefully, and they've got one designed for Audrey Luna, who's singing it, and one that's been designed for me specifically, so that is covered. And you have enough rehearsal that you get used to that feeling. And it is a bit weird at first. It's a bit terrifying at first. But once you get used to that feeling, and you adjust, just as you would adjust for singing in any position. In opera, you can't just stand there and sing. Sometimes you're lying down, sometimes you're doing all kinds of crazy things. You've got to adjust your breathing and adjust for that. But it did work. I did manage it.
Well done. Now, you say the composer, Thomas Addis, is conducting it.
He's conducting.
That a bit scary, sort of thinking, you're not going to get away with any wrong notes, are you?
He's a lovely person, and he's very kind, and he's actually been brilliant. I mean, I've covered this role before. I've covered Garden. I've covered it at the Metropolitan Opera in New York, in this same production in New York. So I'm very familiar with it already. I feel quite at home with it. But watching some of the newer cast members come into it, and they have the deer in the headlights moments, he's very kind, and he explains it very clearly why he said it the way he did. If they're having trouble with something, he says, well, just do it like this, because I said it to be like speech would be. And he says it in the rhythm, and they go, oh. So it's actually very useful having the composer there.
Yeah.
Conducting it, and he can explain exactly what he wanted if anyone's confused. So that's one of the brilliant things about doing new opera and doing contemporary music in general, is you can ask them, they're still here.
Yes.
Yeah. If you're confused. Yeah. So yeah.
Do you find there's a lot more rehearsal for a contemporary opera than there would be for a classic?
There tends to be, yeah. Yeah, it's a good thing. In most of the houses I've worked in, because they cannot assume that we've all done the roles before. They can't assume that we already know everything. They tend to, I mean, I might be generalizing here. I find contemporary operas tend to be theatrically more specific and complicated sometimes. I think it's because they need to sell it in a way to the audience, so they feel they need to sell it because it's not bohème, it's not magic flute, it's something they've never heard of, so they heighten all of that with physicality or just very complicated things going on. So you need that time, and they devote more time to that. So yeah, they do tend to give it another week or two that they would do for standard repertory.
Yeah. So we've had a question sent in by David, who says, when you first get a score of a contemporary opera, how do you start to learn it? What do you start with? Do you start with note bashing or language? Obviously this one's English, but generally.
Yeah, I start the same way I start any score. Is that for me, one of the kind of tips is that treat a standard rep opera the way you would treat a contemporary opera, and vice versa. Because if you go into a standard piece thinking, oh, I know this, I've heard it before, it's obvious how to do this, it's been done before, I can listen to a recording, you're not really engaging with the score properly. It's okay, sometimes we learn things really quickly and sometimes we have to just get it in there, but it doesn't mean that you've fully understood what's going on. And with a contemporary piece, you're forced to do all that work. You've got to look at it very carefully. You've got to go through the whole thing with a fine-tooth comb. But the first thing you try to do is to see the work as a whole, to try to see it from beginning to end and try to understand how it's structured, what goes on, where your character fits in with what's going on before you start note bashing, before you start just trying to get it in the voice, really just looking at the whole thing. And I go through this process with every piece of music I learn, from art songs up to full roles, because you're learning it more thoroughly. You're really giving them a better performance in the end because you're being a better musician about how you approach things. Just learning things by rote, just going note bashing, it doesn't really get you into it. It doesn't make you understand what you're singing about. So I tend to, and I try to, if I'm doing Donizetti, I try to pretend I'm the first person to ever sing this and it's brand new, and really analyze it and look at every section, every moment, every scene, and why did he write it the way he did? Why did he put this here? Why is that written that way? And it just helps you in performance when you get then to where you're trying to make an interpretation and act. It makes that easier because you've done all that work in your head already.
Yeah. So in a way, is it slightly harder to do a classic opera in that you're trying to get rid of all the preconceptions you've got about it? Those endless, repetitions of bohème you've heard in a lift in a shop.
Yeah, it's hard to get that out of ears. Yeah, it's hard to not be comparing yourself to every great singer who's ever sung this before and worrying about being compared in that way. So in a way, it frees you from all that weight. It can feel scary because you think, I'm making these decisions about how to sing this because no one's sung it before, or very few people have sung it before.
Yeah.
And you have to give yourself that musical authority, which can be quite intimidating, but in a way it's quite empowering. So that I'm making this decision because I'm singing it and I'm the only person singing it, so my way is the right way. So it has a double edge to it, but that teaches you. I think I bring this back to my standard rep. Do standard rep when I do a Mozart role or something. I try to bring that feeling back into it. Like, actually, this was new once upon a time. There was a time when no one had ever sung it, and if I'm only copying others, I'm not being a real musician.
Yeah.
Okay. So it does help. It helps your musicianship because you're forced to analyze, especially if it's a piece that is some alternate type of tonality. I mean, Addis is quite tonal. It's polyrhythmic and it can be very complex, but on the page. But once you kind of get his musical language, he's really not that far out. It's wonderful. He mixes, he mashes, he takes things from jazz or pop music or other composers, or he kind of layers that. And we're in the 21st century, and that's what we do now. But it's certainly not as far out and difficult tonally as to some of the 20th century roles that I've tackled.
Yeah.
Which can, you really have to start thinking completely differently, because if it's 12 tone, if it's A tone, you have to think in a different way about it. But once you get that sonority, when you start living in that musical world, it becomes easier, because it's like language.
We actually have a question on this from Ruth, who says, obviously Ades not so atonal, but how do you learn atonal music? For example, she says, when you have to come in on a note which bears no relation to what's just come before it.
Yeah.
And, even as a violinist, I've had that feeling as I've been crawling up the top.
How do I pitch that? How do I get that in there? I mean, there is a certain amount of muscle memory that goes into that, and you get to know these well enough that it just sounds right. It sounds normal in that. And then sometimes you do the, I say to my students all the time, don't be afraid of using your pencil in your score and putting things in and finding some note in orchestra or something you can cling on to that is a half step away, or you can sort of go, oh, that's that one there. Eventually, when you've really embodied the role, it does sound right. You get it, and you start to feel, because the voice is that muscular part of your body, you can just feel the right note. I don't have perfect pitch, nowhere near that sort of, I mean, you have it or you don't. But I'm rehearsing something and have been rehearsing it. Eventually, I can just start on the right note without any cues.
Yeah,
and the body knows how to do it. Just the voice. It just is that a B flat? Yeah, it's a B flat, and you're just guessing. But because you've sung it and sung it and sung it, it feels right. But within the language of that piece, you can start to recognize where things belong. I've learned the role of Lulu, which is a tone. He bent the rules a bit. There are places where it's sort of jazzy and almost tonal, and he wasn't perfect in being a 12-tone composer, but there you start to recognize the tone row. You do start to go, oh, this follows that. If I've just sung that note, the next note has to be one of those notes. It has to fit into this shape. So you have to live in their tone world.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, it's just what we're used to, isn't it? We're used to the normal classical scale. You train yourself to be used to a different scale, and that's the great thing, I suppose, about contemporary opera, having those extra weeks. Really get in the mood.
Yeah, you just have to do all this work. If you have to come in knowing this on your own, you have to be independent of this, and that's the scariest thing, I think, is quite often in standard rep, you can depend on your colleagues a bit more. You can just be sure that everyone's going to have their notes and know their bit, and you can depend on people. Not always, but usually you hope you can. But in this, you should assume that there's going to be people who are really struggling with it, and you need to be solid. You need to be absolutely solid with it.
And do you feel that having perfect pitch is a blessing or a curse? Obviously, for learning it, it's probably a blessing, isn't it, having perfect pitch? But if you're in perhaps, I don't know, on the continent and it's not a 440 or whatever you're used to, do you have colleagues who have perfect pitch who come a cropper because they have it?
I don't know. I think it probably is a problem. I think you'd have to find a way of ignoring that. If you had it, it would probably drive you up the wall. To look on the page and hear something else and know that it's not right. I think it would be a bit of a curse. Yeah.
We got another question from Sandeep here who says, what happens if you get given a role but feel that you've bitten off more than you can chew? I hope he's not in that situation. It sounds like, he's been offered something great and then gets the music and thinks, oh no, what have I done? Have you ever been in that situation?
No.
Not yet.
um, yeah, I suppose everyone has that moment when they first open a score that, how am I possibly going to learn all this? This is crazy. And you do, somehow you do, you get there. I think earlier in my career, I probably had that feeling more often, but I just tell myself now, you did that. If you can do that, you can do this. If you can learn legatee, you can learn this.
Yeah.
You know, because I know I've done really difficult things, and I have that confidence now that if I got there with this role, I must be able to get there with this.
Do you find your memorization quickening as you get older, as you do it more? Do you find you can memorize things more quickly?
Yeah, it's just a muscle, isn't it? It's with practice, everything gets better, and you start to understand things. But it's also that I'm quite disciplined about how I learn things. I start with the text, but don't try to sing straight off. I don't try to read it straight off the page. I don't try to just sight read it and start singing through things. I really do go layer by layer. You start with the text, then you do the rhythm, then you play the melody without singing it. So you're learning, you're using your brain, and you're not overtaxing your voice immediately. Because until we understand how something goes, until we understand where the phrase is heading, you really shouldn't be singing it, because the voice needs to have that information. We think, then we sing. It starts in the head, starts in the brain. And until you really get it, it shouldn't be attempting, because it's actually quite tiring on the voice. And even with Mozart, even with some really standard stuff, when you see people doing coloratura and they keep up the same bit of, you don't really understand that run. You don't really understand where it's going. That's why you can't sing it right. And so understand it first, then practice it.
Yeah, and then be able to perform it under immense pressure, of course. Yeah. We've got Sarah again asking, what was your first big break?
Oh goodness, first one. I think I've had a lot of big breaks, a lot of breaks as they go. I think the biggest leap of faith that turned out well for me was when I was just finished with school. I entered the Metropolitan Opera National Council auditions, which are the American equivalent, I guess, of Cardiff Singer of the World, that type of competition. And I quit my temp job and took a lot of coaching and lessons, and hired an actor friend to give me acting lessons and to stage all my arias for me, so I really had context in my mind when I was performing them. And on the day of the competition, I did my bit, sang. We were all waiting for the results, and I was sitting in the auditorium going, I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent next month, because I haven't been temping for 4 or 5 weeks. And I won. that prize money was really, really handy, but it's sort of a moment where it taught me that if you're serious about this, I'm not recommending everybody go into debt and do crazy things financially, but you do need to decide, I'm going to commit to this. I'm going to make this leap of faith. If I'm going to do this, I've got to go for it. And if it doesn't work out, then I know at least I've done my very best. I haven't sort of part-time tried to get the skills together and go for it. I've really focused all the way.
Yeah. Sometimes you have to put yourself in that dangerous position, don't you, for anything great to happen.
Yeah, it has to matter. It has to really, really matter. And that was sort of a light bulb moment. It was like, okay, it will be all right. I will manage and get to the next step, and I can get to the next. It's a lot of little steps. It's a lot of little breaks, and then sticking to it and really working really hard.
And so after that competition, what led on from that?
I decided to go back to school and go back to graduate school, and I got into the Manhattan School of Music, which meant moving to New York and living in New York and the opportunities that were there. And meeting my English husband and moving over to
I was going to ask, how did you end up over here?
yeah, and just finding my professional world and my my niche basically in the UK. And it's there's a strong tradition of contemporary opera at English National Opera. I've done a lot of work there and learned a lot of big contemporary 20th century roles and some more contemporary newer things as well in 21st century, and just been able to really professionalize that part of what I do, because I've always done new music from being a student onwards. I had a brilliant teacher as an undergrad who just shoved all this crazy stuff at me. You know, learn this. Don't be afraid of it. Go for it. It will help you. It will help you in musicianship. And if you're willing to do it, there's a lot of singers who aren't willing to do it.
Yeah.
So,
and also, of course, all these contemporary operas, which seem so frightening to us now. I mean, all the classics felt like that at the time when they were first written, didn't they?
Yeah. So you got to start somewhere.
But we'll wrap up in a minute, but just one final question to you that we have from David. He says, do you prefer contemporary opera to the classics? If you were putting them on your hi-fi at night time with a large glass of wine, that you prefer your day hanging, singing, what would you put on?
I mean, in some ways I do. In some ways I enjoy, just for my own amusement, I will listen to Adams and Glass and Addis and I will listen to, I will even listen to Lulu and there comes a time when you need a magic flute to cheer you up sometimes. A lot of the mid 20th century, early 20th century can be very psychologically dark, can be quite challenging in that way. I love that because I'm interested in that. I'm fascinated with psychology and of course it was a dark time in the history of the world, especially here in Europe. So it makes sense that music was being written. And sometimes you just need a little uplifting. Sometimes it's a relief to do a magic flute because you think that I have faith in humanity again. But I love traditional opera. I fell in love with that as a student. It's gorgeous. It's wonderful. But I do enjoy the new things. They're interesting, they're relevant, and challenging. Yeah. But my favorite thing to listen to is Richard Strauss. I get a really big kick. It's something
Cavalier.
Edging into early 20th century. He's edging into that. He hasn't gone completely into the Wagnerian heaviness. There's still a bit of Mozart in it. It's a wonderful balance of that late Romanticism, early 20th century experimentation, and the comfort of Mozart's clarity.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Laura. It's been lovely to talk to you today. Enjoy The Tempest, which is when exactly? When do the performances start?
I believe we open on the 14th of June and we finish on the 27th of June. 5 performances, and again 3 more performances in October at the Staatsoper.
Wonderful, brilliant. Thank you very much for joining us, Laura. We'll see you again soon. Bye, everybody.
Our little friends are flying